Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the 6th lecture of the 59th public lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus, titled Traveling Archaeologies. Due to an attempted cyber attack against the University of Cyprus, which took place 10 days ago, some of our IT facilities, including Zoom, had not been available to students and members of staff of our university. This is why the scheduled lecture by Dr. Christine Haywood last week was cancelled. However, we are now back and several digital and online facilities are gradually functioning again. We will inform everyone towards the end of the semester when Dr. Haywood's online lecture will be rescheduled for. It is my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Kostas Sbonias, Associate Professor in Aegean and Near Eastern Civilizations at the Department of History of the Ionian University in Corfu since 2014. Dr. Sbonias studied history and archaeology at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens and holds a PhD in Aegean prehistory from the University of Heidelberg. He worked as postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Cambridge MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research for the Boeotia Project and at Durham University for the Populous Project with Professor John Bintliff. He has lectured at the universities of Crete, Thrace, the Hellenic Open University, and the Ionian University. He also directs the postgraduate program of the department in history and documentation. He has been involved in numerous projects in the Cyclades, Crete, the Ionian Islands, and mainland Greece, focusing on Aegean prehistory, landscape history, and archaeology in a diachronic and interdisciplinary perspective, namely with the series of Boeotia Project, the Paliki Kefalonia Survey Project, the Tripiti Project, the Vrissina Survey, and the Thirassia Island Survey Project. He has participated in the final publication of the pre-palatial cemeteries of Moniou the Yitria and Gournes Cemetery in Crete. He co-directs the Prehistoric Thirassia Project and is currently excavating at the early and Middle Bronze Age settlement site of Kimissis at Thirassia, about which we shall hear more this evening. At Corfu, he co-directs the Fisheries, Cultural Heritage, Identity and Participative Societies project on cultural heritage and sustainable planning. Some of his latest publications include the edited volumes Corfu's Coastal Settled Environments, Cultural Heritage and Local Communities, published in 2020 in collaboration with Andreas Kapetanios, and Thirassia 3, Archaeological Research and Landscape History of an Island Community, published in 2021 in collaboration with Iris Tsahili. Closing this introduction, I would like to kindly ask all our participants to keep their cameras off and their microphones muted. Should you wish to address a question or comment to our speaker, feel free to use the chat button on Zoom. You may also switch on your cameras after the end of the presentation to address your question directly to the speaker by raising your hand and unmuting your microphone. Dear Costa, we look forward to hearing all about your ongoing excavation project in the early and Middle Bronze Age settlement of Kimissis in Thirassia. The microphone is yours.
Thank you, dear Thanasis. Just a second. Sorry. Okay. Has it appeared, the PowerPoint?
Actually, it appears smaller. We can't see the full screen. Can you try
sorry,
presentation again?
Okay, news. Just a second. Sorry for this.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Dear Thanasis, thank you very much for the invitation and your kind presentation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and see, even from distance, so many old friends and colleagues from different phases of my life: Heidelberg, Durham, the Boeotia Project, Apostolos from our common research on Thracia. And it's a great pleasure to be also with our audience. Thank you for connecting this evening for this lecture, in which I will share some results from our research on Thracia. In my talk, I will present some new finds for the settlement history of prehistoric Thracia, which once formed part of the volcanic island of Thera, on the basis of the ongoing research at the prehistoric settlement site of Kimesis at the southern tip of the island. The site emerges as an important settlement located on the imposing hilltop rising on the west side of the pre-eruption Santorini caldera, with a long period of habitation from the beginning of the early Bronze Age to the end of the Middle Cycladic period, when the site was definitely abandoned. And in these slides, we see the hill of Kimesis. Just a second. Okay. We see the hill of Kimesis at the southern tip of Thracia. Our site is located on the southeastern side of the hill, looking at the volcano of Santorini and the caldera of Thera. This research is associated with the collaboration of many institutions and projects, and so in my talk, I represent a large team of colleagues who have worked together on Thracia. In the first phase of our project, entitled Island Cultures in a Diachronic Perspective, the Case of Thracia, a Thalis research program led by Claire Palivou from University of Thessaloniki, in cooperation with our universities, the Ionian University and Crete University and the 4-8 of Cyclades, as well as the Institute of Mediterranean Studies in Crete. Key factor was the multidisciplinary and integrated research for the study of the human responses to the changing environment of the island in a diachronic perspective. Main themes of interest were the volcanic processes and the formation of the relief and morphology of the island, the historicity of choices concerning habitation and use of the natural resources, the density of human presence on Thracia in different periods, local land use practices, etc. The study of vernacular architecture and the anthropological and ethnographic study were also key aspects of the project. From an archaeological point of view, our research involved an intensive archaeological field survey in cooperation with the 4-8 of Cyclades, which covered different parts of the island. In the slide on the left, we see the transects, the survey transects and the areas we covered through intensive research. On the right, we see the survey grid in one of the sites we discovered during the survey, the site of Kimesis, and which is a multi-period site. In red, you can see the distribution of the prehistoric pottery, part of it in situ and part of it eroded on the slopes of the hill. And here some also photos from our work on this site and some of the pottery found. The research involved also a geological survey to establish the geological structure and paleotopography of Thracia, which produced the new geological map of the island. We see this map here on the left. It's the work of Yorgos Voukalakis from IGME. It involved also geophysical prospection by Apostolos Aris for the correlation of surface densities of material with subsurface linear structures. We see here Apostolos by the cliff at the site of Kimesis. Since 2014, the systematic excavation at Kimesis, co-directed by Iris Zahili, Maya Evstathio, and myself, with the important collaboration of Claire Palivou, aims to create the conditions for a more comprehensive approach to the prehistoric landscape of the island. Another project, which is currently running by Kostas is Arc to Plant project, aiming at the ethnobotanical and archaeobotanical study of Thracia, and involves this project also the study of the archaeobotanical material from our excavation at Kostas. In this slide, you can see some of the publications of the wider project covering different aspects of our research. The last volume, as Thanasis mentioned, is the volume Thracia 3, the volume on the archaeological field survey. And forthcoming is the fourth volume of the project, edited by Clary Palivou on the vernacular architecture of the island. In my talk today, I will focus in one aspect of this wider project, the study of the Bronze Age settlement at Kostas, and I will try to place the preliminary results from our work in Thracia in the overall context of prehistoric Thera, to the extent that the excavation at Kostas sheds new light on particular periods and aspects of the prehistoric landscape of Thera. The settlement history of Thera is dominated by the site of Akrotiri, where occupation throughout the Bronze Age creates a view of stability and continuity in the long term, with the maritime settlement being the main nucleus throughout this long period. And of course, this site has provided most of our evidence for prehistoric occupation at Thera. For the earlier part of the Bronze Age, there is a growing amount of material from the lower deposits of the site, which documents the late Neolithic and early Cycladic phases and reflects a prosperous community with a growing position in the developing maritime networks of the Bronze Age Aegean. The exact nature of this earliest occupation is less clear, as the evidence is mostly associated with secondary depositions in the underground early Cycladic rock-cut chambers and pits from the lowest levels of the site. And on the left, we see some of these pits, and here also in the section from a pillar shaft, or with debris from the later town. Also, the domestic or funerary character of this material has been debated, even if some architectural finds have been located. Clearer is the established settlement of the Middle Bronze Age with a more introverted character in the early part of the phase and the prosperous, more populous and expanding one in the later part of the Middle Cycladic period, on evidence for growing contacts and a stronger Cretan influence on the Cycladic islands is attested. The wider settlement pattern of Thera is less well understood. For the late Bronze Age, Davis and Cherry already in the late 80s drew attention to the existence of a hierarchically differentiated system of settlement in the late Cycladic I period, which, as suggested, was subsidiary to the central site of Akrotiri. Sotirakopoulou has also supported that in the Middle Cycladic period, on several Aegean islands, including Thera, there was a divergence from the nucleated pattern and drew attention to a more variable situation, which was contingent upon each island's history. In the slide on the left, we can see a distribution of prehistoric sites on Thera and Thracia from different periods, with our site of Kostas here at the southern end of modern Thracia. Now, evaluating such evidence for settlement distribution in pre-eruption Thera, we should take into account the consequences of the Bronze Age eruption, which changed dramatically the landscape, covering the prehistoric surface under 40 to 60 meters of volcanic ash. And in the slide on the right, we can see in the geological map of Thracia how the layer of pumice of Minoan eruption, the material of the fourth phase of the eruption, covers the whole island, apart from the wall of the caldera, where we can see all the geological strata, and also some patches in the ravines of the island. In this context, prehistoric remains have come to light in ravines when these strata are removed by river erosion, and this is the case at Akrotiri and nearby Potamos, but mostly during coring operations of the 19th and the 20th centuries, which have removed the thick volcanic deposits. This is the case with almost all the quarry sites located along the brow of the caldera at Ia, by Fira, and by Megalochori, prehistoric sites found by removing these thick deposits. And also this is the case at Alafouzos quarry at Thirasia. We can have a look at it in this slide, where in the 19th century, at the time of the big volcano eruption of 1866, which attracted to the island many scholars, among them also the French geologist Ferdinand Fouquet, a two-story late Cycladic house came to life. This building, which was not possible at the time to be placed in its right archaeological context, was excavated and published by Fouquet, who investigated the geological strata on which this building was founded and presented the finds in the framework of the interest on the history of the eruptions of the Santorini volcano. And these lower photos here are photos from his publication. Iris Zahilis' book located the position of this first Cycladic building and offered the motivation for our new project on the island in 2007. Other known prehistoric sites at Thira are located in areas with thin layers of ash or in areas where the prehistoric relief is exposed on the surface, probably due to the steepness of the ground and the subsequent erosion of the volcanic deposits. This is the case of sites known through surface finds, and this has been also the case for our site at Kimesis, which was found during the field survey on the exposed surface of the Bronze Age. The upper right slide shows the hill of Kimesis, and here we can see how the thick volcanic deposits gradually lessen as we come close to the top of the hill, and where they are completely absent as we are coming close to the southeast and east slopes of the caldera. This slope, probably up to this point, forms part of the earlier caldera of the island, which existed in the prehistoric period. Now, as many of these sites are known through surface finds and 19th and early 20th century work, they are not properly published. And this makes an exact determination of their size, function, and chronological range problematic. Some more cemeteries and settlement sites have been partially excavated during more recent rescue excavations of the F48 of Cyclades, such as the cemetery sites at Agios Ioannis Eleimon, the settlement site of Telos, the settlement site at Raos, Megalochori quarry, with Akrotiri remaining the sole systematic prehistoric excavation on the island. Examining this distribution, we should also keep in mind that present flat areas of both Thira and Thirasia did not form part of the pre-eruption morphology of the island, and they were created by the minor eruption deposits. Excluding these flat and low-lying areas, and we can see here in these lower photos these coastal plains of the islands were created by the volcanic deposits. So if we exclude these areas, the favorable areas for habitation move to the southern part of both islands. In the wider area of Akrotiri Peninsula, especially in the Bronze Age, and in the southern part of modern Thirasia, as is evidenced by the older finds at Alafouzos quarry, and also by the finds that are coming to light in our excavation at Kimesis. Another focus of settlement is created in the high areas along the brow of the caldera, which could be associated with pasturage and the agricultural exploitation of the adjacent inland plateaus, which, though they had a steeper morphology before the infilling of these areas by the deposits of the Mainon eruption. Access to the sea from the interior of the caldera at small anchorages, as is the case of Balos, and the prominent character of these sites, of these locations, might have been also a factor for their position. This distribution along the brow of the caldera is also in line with the wider reconstructions by geologists of a ring-shaped island extending from the Akrotiri lighthouse to Asbronisi, with a water-filled caldera and a small strait to the southwest. In these lower drawings here, we can see some more recent suggestions which reconstruct a possible strait on the north side of the caldera, but no outlet to the southwest. And now, in my opinion, concerning the absence of this outlet in the southeastern part of Thera, this is a hypothesis which is not based on any sound evidence and also doesn't agree with the findings from the excavation at Kimesis. Now, how our work in Therasia complements this picture. First, it gives the opportunity to look at an example of the architecture and spatial organization of an early bronze site of the island. We can examine the stratigraphic sequence and how the settlement evolved during the early and middle Bronze Age up to its abandonment and the possible relocation of habitation from Kimesis to Alafousos quarry in the period of the major growth of the late Cycladic one town of Akrotiri. We can also see how research from Therasia sheds new light on the changing forms of the pre-eruptive caldera and what evidence it brings on its post-eruptive form. Our research contributes to the discussion on the date of the eruption of the Santorini volcano. And other issues arise as we're continuing the study of our excavation finds. Important is the study of the eruption episodes which created the landscape by Yorgos Voukalakis, and this enabled the precise reconstruction of the phases of the evolution of Therasia as a result of the periodic explosions of the Santorini volcano. The Therasia lavas, dated 45 to 25,000 years ago, dominate with their cliffs the upper part of the caldera and form a prominent feature which attracted settlement in several periods. And in this slide, we see several sites which were detected by our survey. And one of these sites is the site of Kimesis, in which also these Therasia lavas play an important role for the layout of the settlement site and also for the construction of the buildings. The prehistoric surface of the island consisted of the deposits of the so-called Cape Riva eruption, which occurred 22,000 years ago. It was the penultimate major catastrophic explosion of the Santorini volcano. This explosion formed the topography of prehistoric Thera, and its strata are exposed on the southeast slopes of Kimesis Hill. We see in this slide on the left some of these pre-eruption terraces that are visible on the surface on the slopes of Kimesis Hill, while in other parts of the island we can see how thick the layer of the Mainon eruption is, having totally buried the surface of this Cape eruption geological layer, which was the prehistoric surface of the island. All the geological strata of Therasia were also visible during the Bronze Age in the lower part of the walls of the caldera, which was already formed, and they were exploited as a source of building material by the inhabitants of the prehistoric settlements. And in this slide, we can see andesite slabs, which are coming from this lowest geological strata of the caldera. And they were transported to the settlement, and they were used as roof slabs. We often find them on the floors, fallen on the floors, creating a layer, a distraction layer. During the Mainon eruption, the island was cut off from the rest of Thera by the submergence of parts of the island to the north and south, and the plain was created to the west by the deposition of volcanic ash on the low areas below sea level. Pre-eruption Theracia had instead a plain to the south, extending across what is now the bay between Theracia and the small island of Sbonias. The reconstruction of the pre-eruption morphology, which we see here in this slide on the left, was based on the detailed mapping of traces of the 4 deposition phases of the Mainon eruption and the digital reconstruction in several steps up to the final model of the pre-eruption Theracia. In this 3D model of the hill created by Neoptolemus Michailidis from aerial photographs, we can see on the right the pre-eruption relief of the Cape Riva caldera on the southeast terraces of the hill, where the deposits of the Mainon eruption, as I said, are totally lacking. And these are some terraces from this surface. So in this area, the limits of the pre-eruption caldera must have been essentially the same as they are now, with part of it forming the walls of the extant caldera. The sheer cliffs in the southern edge of the hill, on the contrary, form part of the Mainon caldera. And here we see a view of these fallen rocks of the Mainon caldera, which are just below our settlement site, the buildings up here on this terrace. The settlement walls leading to the edge of cliff demonstrate how the whole side of the hill collapsed, taking part of the settlement with it. Originally, the site was located at a favorable location, high above the edge of the plain, protected from the northerlies, and close to the entrance to the caldera, which might have provided a safe deep anchorage. The northern part of the caldera bay, on the contrary, was quite shallow, as is evidenced by the development of brown algae colonies, which created characteristic stromatolites, which have been found in Theracia and northern Thera. The defensibility of a prominent hill overlooking the coast, often in association with fortification walls, is a location choice also seen in other settlements in the Aegean from the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, and is also related to small fortified sites on hilltops near the sea at the end of the early Cycladic II period, the phase of the so-called Castri group. The site of Chemises has provided pottery from earlier phases of the early Cycladic period, pottery of the early Cycladic I and the transitional early Cycladic I-II campus phase, and also the Keros-Syros pottery of the Keros-Syros culture of the early Cycladic II. So this location on a prominent hill is not related to choices associated with the later part of the early Cycladic II period and the Castri phase. With regard to the size and extent of the site, the distribution of surface pottery, we see in this slide the distribution of prehistoric sites, in blue the early Cycladic pottery, in red the middle Cycladic pottery. This is pottery distribution recorded during the survey. So this prehistoric distribution around the site, also in the northern parts, as well as the geophysical research by Apostolos Aris, which shows linear structures around the flat hilltop, not only in the southeastern part where we're excavating now, but also in other areas of the hill. And the trenches of the excavation on the upper southeastern part of the hill indicate that the remains may cover an area of approximately 0.4 hectares, to which the collapsed part of the site must be added. This makes a comparable size to other small hilltop settlement sites, such as Markianion Armorvos and Castrion Syros, but smaller than the other larger early Bronze Age settlements of the Cyclades in the Aegean, such as Karkos Onios, Palamarion Skiros, and of course the towns of the Eastern Aegean. The trenches opened as part of the systematic excavation are located in the pre-eruption terraces of the southeastern hillsides, which are shown in green in this map. All this is pre-eruption surface, while trenches closer to the top of the hill were sealed by the Mainon eruption deposits, and in these areas there is a better preservation of the structural remains. In this slide on the left, you can see the removal of the volcanic deposits during the excavation, first the layer of ash and then the layer of pumice. The settlement is laid out on horizontal levels in the upper terraces of the hill, as far as this trench here on the slope, trench O. In the excavation part of the site, there are three main levels of use following the terrain, with buildings oriented according to the terrain and the natural features of the landscape, such as rocks. On the steep east hillside, there is artificial terracing at the passageway built from large volcanic rocks, which delimits access to the hilltop as the path is coming up the slope of the hill to this point. High retaining walls on the northwestern part of the site in this area here create another boundary and support the structures which were constructed above. Two roads were identified. This is one of these roads, following the contours of the prehistoric hillside. In the lower terrace, in this area here, there is a building which contained fairly rectangular roof spaces, while other buildings, for example, as this building in this area, have ellipsoid plans. In overall, in this area here, there are three ellipsoid buildings. In this photo, one of them has been excavated. This ellipsoid building that we can see here in the middle had an access to an open air courtyard, which contained deep deposits of several periods from the early Cycladic 1-2 period to the end of the Middle Bronze Age. In the terrace above, in the area AB here in the photo, there is an open paved space in which the ellipsoid building was partly encased. A road delimited by retaining walls leads to the western part of the site, where a series of buildings and spaces, among them a large apsidal building and an external monumental wall, it's this area here, have come to light with significant deposits of the early and middle Cycladic phases. A staircase leads through the external wall of the early Cycladic period into the internal upper part of the hill, so a possible defensive role of this external wall might be possible. We should consider also this function of this monumental wall. We see here a section by our architect, Kostas. We see the staircases going up through this opening of the wall. And if you look at the scale, the height is up more than 2 meters, close to 3 meters of this wall, which is built by large volcanic stones, as we can see in this section. The middle Cycladic building, which we can see here, apsidal building, is significantly larger than the ellipsoid structures of the early Cycladic period and is particularly well preserved. It has a monumental apsidal shape and is embedded in the part of the apsis within a stone terrace artificially constructed with stones, which probably had a retaining character. The building thus shows elements of a subterranean architecture from this part of the apsis and is preserved to a great height of 2 meters, and this allows us to make observations on the upper structure of such buildings. A transverse structure occupies the part of the apsis where a large number of obsidian tools, pottery, and a steatite seal were found, while the western wall of the room is occupied by a bench. This building had access to this apsidal building was via an open-air courtyard, which had the 2 benches here in the external wall of the apsidal room, and was associated with domestic activities. Remnants of spinning and possibly weaving work were found there. This building preserves in situ architectural remains of the last phase of the settlement of the late Middle Cycladic period. In general, the layout of the site and the tendency to build on a steep, prominent hill, creating artificial terraces and retaining walls, into which the rough surfaces of high rocks were incorporated, is a characteristic of the early Cycladic organization of space. This created a stepped layout which used a system of closed and open-air spaces and incorporated the rock formations into the structures. We can see here these cliffs, which they were walled, they were covered by a wall, and the structures were close on the side of this cliff. The use of ellipsoid, partly subterranean structures as domestic and possible storage areas, along with more rectangular spaces, is also a characteristic of the built space. These features dominated and confined the appearance of the site throughout the life of the settlement in the early Middle Bronze Age. The continuing use of apsidal buildings in the Middle Cycladic period is documented also at other settlement sites in Santorini, as Phtelos and Megalachori, creating a tradition of ellipsoid architecture on the island with common characteristics, which differs from the more regular planning of the Middle Cycladic town of Akrotiri, and represents possibly an earlier tradition of the island, which has not been fully considered till now. Modifications during the Middle Bronze Age, the plan of the site at Kimsis, can be seen in the abandonment of the steeper areas of the hill, which seem to fall out of use in the Middle Cycladic period, judging from the concentration of the Middle Cycladic deposits, mainly in the highest and more level parts of the hill, and also in the larger dimensions of the excavated buildings. Now, considering the phases of occupation and the chronology of the site, the study of the stratigraphy and associated potteries in progress, so these are preliminary results. In the lowest levels, there are ceramic affinities with the early Cycladic I or Grotta Pylos culture, but more substantial is the presence of the transitional early Cycladic I-II campus phase, which occurs in closed deposits in the lowest levels, in cavities and in rock fissures. The lowest floor deposits are associated mainly with pottery of the Keros-Syros culture of the early Cycladic II, followed by material of the late Cycladic II period, equivalent to the Castri phase, although characteristic shapes of Castri group are lacking from our assemblages. The middle Cycladic material is also stratified with pottery belonging to the earlier and later part of the period. And as I told before, we also have a kind of horizontal stratigraphy, since part of the settlement site were abandoned in the late Cycladic period, and in other parts we have the last buildings which were abandoned in the middle Cycladic phase. The early Cycladic material is characterized by a wide spectrum of dark-faced plain and monochrome slip pots. The provenance of the raw materials lies in the geology of the wider area of Akrotiri, with which chemists shared a common Theran potting tradition, as exploitable clays did not occur on Thracia in the Bronze Age. The petrographic analysis of the survey material by Georgia Kordadzaki has documented imported pottery from neighboring islands such as Naxos and Chios, but also from more distant ones like Kea. The amount of talc wear, which corresponds well to its frequency in the early Cycladic Akrotiri, indicates that chemists might belong to the group of Western Cycladic islands with higher concentrations of talc wear. Some quantities of furnace wear and dark on light, fine painted wear also occur. In the middle Cycladic period, calcareous pale fabrics predominate. This is from the survey material, and these are photos from the excavation. So these calcareous pale fabrics predominate, which were associated with a Cycladic white wear and correlate with a large spectrum of wears as plain, monochrome slip, dark on light, pattern painted, and bichrome painted vessels. A particular find from a closed stratified assemblage of the early Cycladic period, early Cycladic II period, found on the floor level, is a vertical strap handle which preserves the impressions of two seals. The first, this one, has geometric designs and belong to a known seal tradition of mainland Crete and the Cyclades. According to my opinion, it could well be a Cycladic seal. The second, and here some parallels of this of this impression with geometric designs. The second impression consists of 3 friezes, each one decorated by 5 to 7 signs, which give the impression as coming from an inscribed seal. We are currently studying the character of these signs, which have no parallels among the later known scripts of the Aegean, as the so-called Arcane script of the Middle Minoan-A period, or the later Cretan hieroglyphic script, both appearing engraved on seals. This vase is of non-local origin, and Georgia Kordadzaki is currently carrying on a petrographic analysis of this fragment, which comes from a closed early Cycladic deposit. It was found on this floor here, near the threshold, which led from an exterior room to a small room, which had probably storage areas. So we're preparing this find for fabrication, and this might also give some more information and shed some light to the shadowy origins of the script in the Aegean. Our work in progress involves also other categories of the material culture, and here a slide with our specialists, Yorgos Varsanis and Andreas Irigou, studying stone tools and obsidian tools from the excavation. The archaeobotanical study was carried out within the framework of the Arc2Plant research program by the archaeobotanologist Evgenia Gadzogia, and involved the installation of a flotation machine in Thracia, which permitted us to process a bulk of soil samples in situ. The preliminary archaeobotanical study indicated a variety of seals such as barley, haldoan, and wheat. Among pulses, grass is the most frequent, and from fruit only figs seeds have been found, while wild flora is characterized by a wide variety. The geoarchaeological study by Dimitra Milona from INSTA Study Center shows a very poor preservation of the mammal bones. The sample that we can see here is an exception in the good preservation of the bones. The majority of the bones belong to sheep and goats of all ages, from newborn to old. Cattle and pigs are almost completely absent. The poor preservation of the assemblage and the small number of surviving bones allows only a generalized understanding of livestock practices in the area. The presence of all ages of animals in such a small sample could perhaps be linked to their rearing within the settlement at household level and not in herds. Cut and burn marks on the best preserved bones are associated with consumption practices, but the sample size does not allow for firm conclusions. Better represented is the marine world. Marine mollusks are preserved in very good condition and are common. And with the exception of a few fragments, possibly worked, of pen shell and triton shell, most come from limpets, top shells, and sea urchins, the typical species of rocky shores of the southern Aegean in the Bronze Age. Fish bones are, especially the larger ones, are surprisingly plentiful and well preserved. Parrotfish, gilt-head sea bream, and white sea bream were identified. Now, the site was abandoned at the end of the Middle Cycladic period, possibly as a consequence of an earthquake, which also destroyed the late Middle Cycladic town of Akrotiri, followed there by a second earthquake in the early Cycladic I period, which represented in the so-called seismic distraction level. At Kimises, no occupation has been identified after the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and there are no traces of late Cycladic I material. It is possible that the focus of habitation in the late Bronze Age Thracia shifted to the low-lying slopes to the west at the site discovered in the 19th century at Alafouzos quarry, with an architecture that marks a complete break with the previous tradition of the settlement at Kimises, resembling that of South Thera and Akrotiri, and bearing the marks of Minoan influence. The abandoned settlement at Kimises remained in ruins approximately for a period of a century, till the Minoan eruption sealed the site under the volcanic debris of pumice and ash. And in these slides, we can follow the progress during the excavation from the surface layer, which is covered by ash, by Minoan ash, to the removal of these layers till the buildings which were covered by these volcanic layers are revealed on the surface, giving us possibly an impression of how the settlement looked like at the time of the destruction, at the time of the eruption. An important find located directly under the layer of pumice from the Minoan eruption is a charred olive tree trunk, which was found among partially burnt stones, together with pottery of the late Middle Cycladic period. This is this piece of wood, which comes from an olive. This is the area where it was found, together with this pottery of the late Middle Cycladic period, and some sherds. We can see here some sherds partially burned. And here is a picture before the excavation of the layer of pumice, which is this one. Below this was revealed this shrub, which we see in this photo. Samples from the Thirassia olive were studied by Charlotte Pearson and Greg Hodgins at the University of Arizona at the laboratories of Tree-Ring Research and Accelerator Mass Spectrometry. And this evidence is added to the olive tree branch buried on Thera during the eruption, which has given the radiocarbon date of around 1613 BC. The gap between this radiocarbon date and the conventional archaeological date of the eruption, placed around 1524 BC, is difficult to address as the date of the eruption occurs during a radiocarbon age plateau, which covers the period of around 1620 to 1540 BC. And this poses limitations for radiocarbon dating based on short-lived samples. The annual growth rings of trees are taken into account to solve this problem, and it has been tried by several specialists to constrain the calendar date by modeling multiple C14 determinations via a wiggle match. In the case that a record of C14 might have captured the slope in the calibration curve preceding the plateau. The problem with olive trees, as is the Thirassia shrub, is that they do not necessarily produce annual growth rings in the way other trees do. And this hinders the ability to wiggle match the sequence against the calibration curve. The results of the analysis for the Thirassia samples have been submitted and will appear shortly in scientific review, in a journal Scientific Review, in a joint paper with Charlotte Pearson. And they show that the uncalibrated radiocarbon measurements are broadly consistent with determination for the Santorini olive, giving slightly younger dates of around 20 radiocarbon years. The calibrated ranges that best represent the youngest portion of the Thirassia olive indicate radiocarbon dating possibilities for the eruption encompassing the late 17th and entire 16th century BC. And this reflects, as I said, the problematic nature of attempting to date an event which occurs on a radiocarbon plateau. Charlotte Pearson suggests increased probabilities for a mid-late 16th century BC date for the eruption, taking into account ice core data, overlapping of younger sulfate markers from ice core data with increased posterior calendar age density for the outermost samples from Thirassia. Now, let's summarize our results in the wider context of Thera. In the early Cycladic I and early Cycladic II period, the number of known sites in the prehistoric landscape of Thera is limited. The early Cycladic cemetery at Phira Quarry, uncovered in the 19th and early 20th century by mining operations, revealed slab-covered schist graves, Cycladic figurines, pottery, and other artifacts. Together with similar finds from Akrotiri, as well as Cycladic figurines purchased on the island, this might indicate a dispersion of communities, although it is not clear if Thera also featured the wide scattering of very small sites and cemeteries observed on other Cycladic islands. Akrotiri and Kimsis both have provided evidence for occupation at the beginning of the early Cycladic period, in the early Cycladic I and the transitional early Cycladic I-II period, or Campos phase, and during the Keros-Syros culture. This is the early Cycladic II period, with substantial architectural remains at Kimsis. The pattern of prominent habitation sites along the caldera continued in the later part of early Cycladic and in the early middle Cycladic period, with sites such as Telos, which features, as said before, ellipsoid subterranean structures and a wall lining similar to that of Kimsis. The settlement site at Megalohori probably also had an early Cycladic phase. It is located in this area, and serves with chemises and also telos elements of an ellipsoid architecture, which it seems created a common tradition during the early Cycladic period, which continues as we see in chemises during the Middle Bronze Age. The access of chemises to the same rate of imported wares as Akrotiri indicates that the settlement might have acted independently in the early Bronze Age trading networks, constituting another focus of settlement in a dispersed landscape which was not solely dominated by the coastal side of Akrotiri. At chemises in the early Middle Cycladic period, a smooth transition is noted in terms of settlement and type of structures. However, a change is observed in Theran pottery production, marked by the gradual disappearance of the dark, low calcareous fabrics and the predominance of the Cycladic white pottery, which would become the dominant pottery tradition at Thera in the late Middle Cycladic period. This might reflect a strategic shift into specialized productions to which all known sites of the island had access. In the later Middle Cycladic period, the abandonment of sites along the caldera of Ira, along with the continuation of settlement at Megalochori, might reflect a growing nucleation and a more populous landscape in the wider area of Akrotiri Peninsula. The rescue excavation by Megalochori by Televantou revealed the remains of buildings from the later Middle Bronze Age and the transition to the late Cycladic I period with Minoanizing pottery and bronze objects, which indicate a flourishing hinterland with villages and other sites of an agricultural character. At Thirasia, as we saw, habitation continued, albeit restricted to the more level areas of the hill, with access to pottery of the same quality as that of Akrotiri, including imported Middle Minoan fine ware. The vast majority of the pottery consumed at the site in this period was likely produced at Akrotiri, as the homogeneity and high degree of specialized production indicate. It is only in the late Cycladic I period that a shift in the settlement pattern can be observed, after the abandonment of Middle Cycladic settlement sites, such as Kimissis on Thirasia at the end of the Middle Cycladic period, and the abandonment of the settlement at Megalochori as a consequence of a seismic destruction that occurred in the transition to the late Cycladic I period. During this period, in the hinterland of Akrotiri Peninsula, as in more distant parts of the island, as at Alafouzos quarry, on Thirasia, we find a range of sites with substantial structures, a diffusion of Minoan architecture, and a quality and range of finds comparable to those from Akrotiri town. Apart from the concentration and processing of agricultural production in these sites, specialized craft activities were also organized. Some of these sites might be identified as small rural villages, such as Alafouzos quarry, which also had access to nearby anchorages. Building complexes also appear at sites such as Kokino Voudon here and Raus, excavated by Matari, a site with a residential character, a sophisticated architecture, and a link to the countryside. This might indicate a more complex and functionally differentiated system, which appears to this extent only in this period of the major growth of the late Cycladic I town of Akrotiri. Concerning Kimissis, the long lifetime of the settlement indicates a balanced way of life with a long tradition of equitable communal organization. Its political and social organization is apparent in its overseas relations and above all in the changes observed in the archaeological record. Some of these changes led to the contraction of the settlement in the Middle Cycladic phases, associated with demographic factors, means of production, intensification of maritime activity centered on the Middle Cycladic town of Akrotiri, and to its complete abandonment and the shifting of habitation to the west, to a site resembling those of South Thera and bearing the marks of Minoan influence, as we see from the architectural features of the house excavated at Alafouzos quarry. The research on Therasia provides us with a great deal of useful evidence on the conditions and parameters that led to these major changes in the pre-eruption landscape of Thera during the Bronze Age. And we hope that with the progress of the study of the material, we'll be able to gain more insights into different aspects and give an answer to the many questions that are arising. We finished excavating last summer, so we have already started studying our material during the excavation, but we hope more intensively as in the periods that follow to be able to concentrate in our materials and give an answer to the many questions really that we also have in this material and the site. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was okay with the time.
Yes, you were. Thank you very much, Kostas. Thank you for this fascinating presentation of the characteristics and character of the Bronze Age sites of Kimissis. However, as I'm not a specialist on the period myself, I will give the word for a brief commentary by someone who's familiar to you, my colleague Urania Kuka, while I go through very quickly the chat on potential questions. Urania.